Facebook, I believe, and we are starting our feed on Instagram because that's a separate feed. So we'll just give that just a second. So if anyone is tuned in on those other platforms, just give us a moment. All right, this is Matter Monday for anyone that's joining, and we will be getting started in just a moment as soon as we're able to get our Instagram feed up. That is a separate feed. I need to take my Halloween decorations down, y'all. We are a few days behind.
Yeah, Halloween decorations are good forever.
For sure. Okay, so we are live on all platforms. So, Jalen, if you want to take it away.
Absolutely. So thank you everyone for joining us. We have a bit of a remote setup today, which we don't normally do for these Matter Mondays. We try to do small in-person events to still be aware of social distancing and things like that, but also to make sure that we have fewer technical difficulties. But for this week, we had a bit of a COVID scare. Actually, one of my roommates is having some symptoms and got tested. But we'll see what's going on. But because of that, we wanted to take some extra precautions and make sure that everyone was nice and safe. So you'll see us all in our lovely homes, which I love your home, Morgan. It is so cute.
Thank you. I love it too.
So well
I
for
had to
this.
upgrade my Zoom background because I was getting internally rated as a 0, so we had to upgrade my background.
Absolutely. I was gonna say it's like you've got a backdrop behind you. It's gorgeous.
I know.
We're so
It is real.
So yeah, so welcome to Matter Monday. We are hosting these live events every single week from 7 to 8, and every single week we'll have a different topic that we'll be discussing. This week we'll be talking about the role of news in elections, and specifically local news in local elections, because as those of you who are familiar with Matter know, we're all about local issues and focusing on things locally. So and that's part of the reason why we have Morgan Harper with us today to talk a little bit about kind of what her experience has been in more of the political side of things and kind of what her experience has been since running the campaign. So, with that, I will dive in if you guys are ready.
Sounds good. Let's go.
All right, awesome. So, we'll start off with community stuff. Before we get too in depth, let's do some introductions. So, Cassie, why don't we start with you? And then Morgan after that. A lot of folks in the audience are probably already aware of who Cassie and I are, but just in case you're not, I'm one of the co-founders of Matter as well as the editor-in-chief of Matter News. And with that, I'll give it to you, Cass.
And my name is Cassie Young, and I am a managing director of Gray Matter Media and Matter News.
Yep. Okay. Hi, I'm Morgan Harper. I formerly ran a grassroots campaign for Congress and now founded a new organization called Columbus Stand Up. Organizing political engagement. And then also, I'm an advisor for a national organization called American Economic Liberty Project, which is about taking on consolidated corporate power, which also connects to today's theme in certain ways. So happy to be here.
Absolutely. And I'll actually have some questions for you about that later on. I have to do some digging around today, and I think there's a lot of alignment in things we've been talking about within the news industry, especially around corporations consolidating power in whatever way that means, whatever way that looks like for the industry. Um, so first to start off, Morgan, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about what your experience with the news has been and kind of specifically what you feel like the news's role in your campaign was and things that you kind of learned about the role of news in election through your campaign.
Yeah, sure. So, I would say first that I was given a warning. Ooh, is it echoing for you guys too?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Before launching my campaign and after launching the campaign is like you're never going to get coverage in local news. It's going to be, you know, what I think is referred to as like a blackout, that they're just not going to pick you up, because if they pick you up, then it gets into like relationship issues for them and, you know, the existing power players or whatever. And, you know, I suppose I was a little naive in that when I first heard this, I was like, but it's the news, it's the job of the news to cover what's going on. And if we're running, you know, then you have to cover it. So I will say there was a little bit less of that than I expected from print media. You know, we were covered in the Dispatch, especially once we started getting national media coverage, which is kind of interesting because it's sort of like the inverse of what you would think. But especially once we started getting national media coverage, then I think it applied a little bit of pressure on local media to cover our race and take it seriously. And then also, of course, once people saw that, you know, we were raising money, which is like the typical metric in political terms for being a viable candidate, unfortunately. So, you know, we did end up getting a good amount of coverage in print, even among like the traditional players like the Dispatch. I will say we were fortunate that, you know, and we are fortunate here in Columbus a little bit that we have some diversity in our local print, and when I say print, I mean, you know, because like essentially we're talking about online since we don't have a lot of like physical print. So in that traditional like online print media, we also have, you know, Columbus Underground that was featuring us. We got actually our first news hit was from Cleveland.com, which was interesting because that was an Ohio-based news source, but not Columbus-based because, you know, well, I don't know. We can go into all of that. Now, local TV was a whole different situation. And I don't know how much we're looking to cover both of those things, but it varies a lot by station. And then, you know, for people, it just seemed like there were more barriers to entry to get coverage of our race. And I think a lot of it does connect to somewhat people just being nervous about covering politics generally in like in a deep way, especially talking about like policy issues as it relates to politics, not just like the top line headline or campaign or sticking only to the national political stories. But then also, you know, I think there are certain news stations have their own agendas about what they're trying to cover. And this didn't, you know, what we were talking about didn't necessarily fit into that. But post-campaign, it has been interesting that, you know, I've been a regular on a couple of the news stations, like on Channel 4 for local TV, and then also WSU, which I think we're also fortunate to have both as like an online news source and doing radio and TV has been, you know, a source of coverage as well.
Go ahead, Jay.
I wonder, is that better?
Yep, can hear you.
Oh, strange. Okay. I don't know if it's on Cassie's end. Sorry about that, y'all. We'll try to work to figure that out. We have Night Road Studio running kind of the tech stuff for us. So hopefully they can work on figuring out what's going on with that feedback. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think that gives us a good kind of insider's look at what it's like to get coverage for these kinds of issues. And it's interesting to me that you mentioned the Cleveland.com, which I believe is the online version of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. It's really interesting to me that you mentioned that they covered you. Also very interesting to me that you mentioned that most of the local outlets didn't cover you until that you picked up by national media. Because I've definitely, so for a little bit of background on me, I have not always lived in Columbus. I have really fallen for Columbus, and I think it's a really amazing city. And I think that there is a huge need for nonprofit news here, which is part of the reason why I wanted to like dedicate to working on something that was helping the community here so much. But I've worked in a lot of different places throughout the country, and I've worked even in some like national media and things like that. And it has always been somewhat baffling to me in Columbus that there are stories that I'm like, I know the national media would pick this up and you're not interested in it at all, or that like national media does pick it up and then Columbus media will start picking it up. And I've noticed this kind of trend of like almost needing that external national validation for a story before it's picked up more locally. So it's interesting to hear you mention that kind of in a personal effect as well. So along those lines, I kind of want to open this question up to both of you. If you're not familiar, Cassie's been very involved in kind of the organizer space here in Columbus as well, organizing around a few key issues, primarily around like drug policy and things related to that, but has been fairly plugged in generally. So from each of your kind of individual perspectives, what kind of role do you think the news currently plays in democratic functions, and what kind of role do you think you would like to see it play?
I'll start. Are you good, Cassie? Or okay, I'll start. Yeah, so I mean that's a big question. Yeah, what does it currently play? What could it play? Like, what's the potential? And I guess I'll start with what I think, again, maybe naive, but I think, especially the perception a lot of people have of what the news should be about is this unbiased arbiter of information and provider of information, and almost like, just a record of what's going on with limited editorializing unless it is labeled as being an editorial, right? Unfortunately, what the news has become is embedded with a lot of bias, and I don't even know if it's always intentional, right? I mean, I like the way that you put the distinction between local news, nonprofit news, and I know that's something we're going to get into later. But I think a lot of these the biases are setting narratives that then influence how a lot of other people are thinking about what's going on around them, right? And so that's why it's so impactful and important, the news, and especially the local news, because this was another, learning from the campaign. And I think for a lot of people in our generation, we're not really watching the local news regularly necessarily. I know a lot of people don't pay for cable, or maybe you're entirely streaming. But a lot of people are getting a lot of information still from local news. And so they have a tremendous amount, you all have a tremendous amount of power. And if those headlines, if that language is getting spread in mass across, like 30 papers, or a company that owns the information and controls the information in 30 different places, then these narratives can spread like wildfire, right? And I think we saw a perfect example of that over the spring and summer with the labeling of the actions that were going on downtown as riots versus protests, right? And so, I think that at its best, the news should just be covering what's going on, giving people information to then make an informed decision about what their position is on the current events and what's happening in our community. But we are pretty far away from that, and a lot of it has to do with some forces that are out of our control. I think some of it is intentional and just how the editorial process of different news sources work, but we certainly have a great need for more independent media sources to make sure that people trust the information that they're getting.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna try this, y'all, so sorry, we're having so many.
That sounds better.
Yeah, okay, good. I'm glad. Yeah, we are trying to run this live stream out of our house tonight. We had a switch up, I think Jalen mentioned to y'all on the feed last minute, where we are not doing it at our normal location. And we're doing this remote thing. So thank you for bearing with us through the technical difficulties. I totally connect with what you were just saying, Morgan, especially about the way that things can really spread. And I think when you were talking about that, I was envisioning, I don't know if any of you haven't seen this John Oliver clip of the John Oliver show. He does a whole segment on Sinclair Broadcasting, and does this really brilliant kind of mashup where he pulls together a bunch of clips of broadcasters at different TV stations all over the country, regurgitating the exact same lines that they're given by whoever at this big national company sends these scripts out all over. And then it's like your local news is being written very much for a national audience, or with a national agenda. And so that's really kind of what came to my mind when you were talking about that. And I think it really leaves us with the issue I have with the way that the local news kind of operates, and what it ultimately does for the people, is there is some good journalism and there's some good news, and we need a lot of the news that is out there, but a lot of it is just kind of these bite-sized, like what really bothers me, especially about TV news, is their segments are so or it seems like a lot of their segments, and I have not worked in it and I'm not intimately aware, but are just like so cookie cutter, like 2 minutes. Like, we're going to show you 2 minutes of what's going on with this thing. And that's what we see with newspapers and with some of these TV spots is they're trying to fill very specific like deadlines and trying to fill very specific slots. And they're trying to fit the story into that instead of what we do, which is take the story that needs to be told and figure out from there what's the medium or what's the way that's best going to tell that story. And so what I find and what's frustrating for me is it feels like we're getting a lot of information in the news, but we're not getting much context. So I think Jay Shetty probably paraphrasing like a Buddhist or something said, oh shoot, I lost it. I lost it. But anyways, we'll come back to it if I think of what the quote was. Oh, we're drowning in information but starving for context. That's what it was. So that's very much how I feel about the news nowadays. And it's like we need that information, but the way a lot of news sites are structured, the way a lot of news segments are structured, they're just kind of jumping from one thing to the next, and they're just scratching the surface of so much without really going deep into anything. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, Jay, because I forget how you worded it, but I think that was along the lines.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that gives me some good insight. I think the conversation around bias too is also very interesting. So we've been looking at a lot of stats for Matter to kind of look at what's going on in the industry and how folks are feeling about it. And one of the things that reminded me of what you were talking about, Morgan, with like how bias can come out in a lot of different news organizations and how that can affect people is that over 80% of Americans currently see, quote, a great deal or a fair amount of political bias in news. So 8 out of 10 people are seeing that bias in news. And I think for us as news creators, as storytellers who are giving this information and are hoping to, do good and like be able to help people engage civically, whatever that looks like for them more, part of the problem becomes figuring out how to check our own bias in this situation so that we're not doing damaging things or pushing agendas, even implicitly, that we may not be aware of. But also, I think, is the bias of readers coming into it, right? I think you could take this same article and present it to 4 or 5 different people, and you would get totally different responses on what our bias is as an organization, right? And that creates a really difficult dichotomy where it's really hard to build trust within the community and show that what you're reporting on is genuinely as objective as it can be within the process and understanding that there are like people behind the work that you're doing, right? And I think it's also very interesting along those lines because the news as an entire product has been systemically torn down over the last 4 years, and has been continuously undercut, and that like credibility has been continuously undercut, which kind of leads me to my next question. Obviously, we usually focus on local things, but I think we would be amiss to not talk about the election, considering what has been going on and the role that the news has played in it. So I was wondering if you guys have seen anything in particular with the election nationally, specifically the presidential election, that you found interesting, problematic, or maybe things that you were inspired by with how the news has covered it and kind of how it's affected things on a larger scale, keeping in mind kind of what the dynamic for news has been. I know it's kind of rambling, so if you guys need refreshers, I can definitely give it to you, but I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been encouraged by is there was a lot of organizing happening leading up to the election day around this count. And actually, we did a live where I was in charge of the technology, and it was, very stressful. Oh no, actually, no, that was our illusion. Anyway, I was more involved in hosting, so I really empathize with all this. But where we were educating people about like what that process looks like. Like if Trump is going to try to challenge the results of the election, here's what it might look like, and here's what we can do to counter that. And I do believe that organizers and a lot of movement-based organizations across the country did a good job of actually leading on that issue and spreading the word that this is something we should take seriously. Trump has already shown us enough about who he is to know that this is something that he would likely pursue again, even if it's just from a narrative messaging place, and that can be very dangerous because of his platform. And it can just be sparked and continue to spread further if the media gives into that messaging. And as a result, I don't think we saw the media give it a lot of air. He did try to spread those narratives pretty soon after the election that he had already been putting out there about, invalid ballots and all of this stuff. But the media seemed like more prepared to report that it's happening, because again, we do want the reporting of what's going on, but not giving into like a deep exploration of it. It's like, this is happening, here's some facts to go along with that, the context, and now let's move along. Like, we actually do have results and they are real, and we can continue to report on them, not because we, the media, say they're real, but because election officials in these states are saying that they're real, regardless of what the president is saying, right? That to me is success. And today there's more coming out that McConnell is going to try to deny it. We had our own state attorney general, even though we're not even in play as a state for the presidential count, really, or our count's not in controversy, coming out saying that, he's not going to accept it. So, but all of these things, it's picking up a little bit of steam, but not a lot. And I do think that was because of an aggressive, preemptive messaging and narrative education, really, for media. So that's been good. On the negative side, I would say I've been very disappointed by, Democratic folks that are coming out in House leadership and claiming that races were lost across the country by Democrats because of defund the police and socialism and messages from the far left, right? That to me is giving into not helpful narratives. But what's been interesting and relevant, I could go down like a whole show about that. But for the purpose of this conversation, what's relevant to me is, once you have leaders who this is what they've decided to talk about and they have that platform, they're going to go on every show and they're going to start saying, this is what the problem was, this is what you should believe is the real issue, these young kids are holding us back, or whatever, right? And and that can spread pretty quickly. And then once the national starts covering it, well, a lot of people, as we know, are glued to cable news, and then they'll check in with local news. And so then that can influence how local news is covering it. And it just is going everywhere. So that's been disappointing, because I just don't think that it's rooted in a lot of facts. And you want, and even here, though, I suppose on the positive side, we've seen some of the media that has been pushing back on that. Like, well, but for example, like no Democratic candidate was actually running on a socialism platform, for example. Is that correct? Media can play that role, and that's helpful. But yeah, it's unfortunate when people continue, or different stations and media sources continue to give a platform to leaders that are spreading information that just isn't rooted in fact.
That dovetails well into sort of what I was going to talk about, which is the fact that I think, like, you asked specifically, Jay, about the presidential election. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was talking more of the elections nationally, and the presidential one's obviously the most poignant of that, because of the effect that he's had on the media and what he's said about the media. But if you have broader implications, feel free to talk about them.
No, I think that's good. Hopefully the audio is good. We just had an issue for a second. But no, where I was going to go with it is, I think one of the most encouraging things is the fact that, and I don't know, as a news outlet, this may not be a great thing to say, but like, that people are able to be the news more and more, and we're able to have more and more citizen journalists. And even if they're not fully citizen journalists and not doing, more formal journalism, even before, and what inspired me to found Matter was the fact that people were telling me they were getting more information from my social media than from the local news. So what I'm noticing is that more and more people are distrustful of especially mainstream media. And so I think that sets up nicely, people who are doing things differently, like Matter, but it also means that people are just looking more for influencers, I guess, but like community leaders, influencers that they trust in their community, that know what they're talking about to some extent, or have, some insight that they really trust and connect with. And that's what I'm noticing, is that whether it's those people pointing those people to more information, or just giving a bit of their perspective on it, I think it really helps to have community leaders sort of speaking up about, like you were saying, some of rebuttaling some of the phrases or things that we hear in the media a lot that go unchecked, I think, are at least being checked more and more.
out their own sources of information, because there is this distrust that, connects to a range of factors, some of which we've already touched on, like the pressures of corporate consolidation. Again, some of this it's not like bad intent from journalists for the most part. I think it's a lot of people that are under very extreme conditions by organizations that aren't set up to look at the news, right? Before, when we were preparing for this and I saw the topic, I was looking at Gannett's description in their press release for their investor relations department, and they describe themselves as a market for connecting communities with local businesses. And I was like, well, that's interesting, because that isn't what I would think of as like the role of a news source, right? And so anyway, when people, have that distrust, and I agree with you, Cassie, and then they're going to seek out their own trusted sources of information. And some of those sources of information are going to be honest brokers, and some of them are going to be absolutely extremists who could be taking them into a deeper place of misinformation. And so I think going forward, as we think about, this hopeful post-Trump era, we have a lot of like things that we're going to be battling to try to prevent another leader like this from getting power. It's going to be related to folks' economics. It's going to be related to our political system, but it's also going to be related to the news and sources of information, and how we can like have some common understanding as a country, as a community, as a state, as to what's real, what's not, and who is going to be guiding people to those trusted sources of information.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there more you wanted to say on that, Cass?
I was just gonna say, I like that you pointed out. I think I was painting it a little rosy that now we can turn to each other, but like you said, that can be a positive or a negative, because before I was able to start Matter, and probably the reason I did was because I was playing that role that I describe of people kind of trusting and coming to me for information or insight. But I also felt really unprepared and unqualified to be doing that. I don't have a journalism background. I was doing it on top of a million other things and kind of on the side. So that's why I was like, there's a clear need for this. People tell me all the time, the market need is there, that people just have a desire for more local information specifically. I find that people tend to be less hungry for information on national politics and things like that, just because there is a lot of news about that. And there is a lot of really good news about that too, I think, just because it's national. But when it comes to local races, like for example, I have a lot of friends, a lot of people on my social media, and I'm sure you all do too, that hit you up around election time and say, what's that website where I can look up the candidates again? It's vote411.org. And also people that just straight up ask me, like, who should I vote for? Who should I vote for? Or who am I voting on? And it's so tough because on a local level, thank God for like vote411.org and stuff, there's a lot more than I feel like there even used to be. But for some of these races, even if you do your due diligence and you're researching and you go to all the local outlets, some of them are going to be paywalled, even if they write about these, candidates. And then some of the judges' races, especially, you can't find information on these people. And so you're expected to, be electing people to really powerful positions with having so little information or scrutiny on them and their record in the background.
Absolutely. And I think one of the hard things too is that I think individuals become sources of verification or even just sources of information without having that journalistic scrutiny. But I think that journalistic scrutiny is also really hard for a lot of people to do. I mean, even for us as a news organization, it takes a lot of time. And if you don't have time because you have to work multiple jobs, or you're exhausted from the job you're working, or you're a parent, or whatever else, it makes it really hard to make sure that you can be sure of the information that you're getting. And that's become the issue for news organizations as well, is that like no longer is it the case where as a news consumer, you can just take what your local newspaper is saying in stride and just kind of run with it. Instead, now you have to cross-reference it with other news organizations and see what other ones have said things or whether or not this has been debunked. And I definitely think the paywall feature or like that certain news is blocked off because of having to pay for subscriptions really adds to a lot of those harmful narratives. For example, there was an article that came out a while ago, and I can't remember who originally wrote it because it got picked up by a few different places, but it was essentially saying like the truth is paywalled, but the lies are free. And so it was talking about how there's a lot of like propaganda that's dressed up as news organizations that are free online, and that those are readily available for people to share on Facebook or in their own social networks, that spreads misinformation. But the truth, the good journalism that we need the money to pay for, is paywalled. And so it becomes this like negative kind of feedback cycle of journalists asking for money for this, but then that prohibiting people from getting real genuine information about what's going on, and just in some cases becoming more distrustful. So yeah. All right. I think there was something else I was going to say about that. I can't remember it now. So if I remember, I'll circle back to it. But I actually, there's one more bit that's very specifically about the news and kind of democratic processes. And it's touches a bit more on that idea of kind of harmful narratives that the media can continue to propagate and perpetuate. But then from there, I think it would be good for us to kind of broaden our conversation out to be a little bit more of some of the things that I think are values that might be aligned between us, or things that are similar that we could touch on in kind of a broader, more civic engagement level than necessarily democratic processes. Before I get to that, though, Morgan, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what happened with the New York Times editor when you were running for campaign. So I saw a little bit about that story, and I was like, I've gotta ask. So if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about that and what that experience taught you, if anything.
Yeah, well, that was a pretty memorable moment from the campaign. So this was the beginning of August. We launched the campaign July 1st, 2019. And then the beginning of August, we got the endorsement from Justice Democrats, which is a national progressive organization that endorses candidates that are running on a no corporate money platform, and in addition to having strong climate and healthcare positions. And so it was a big deal because, it's a big national org, and once they endorse, then they'll promote your race, and you kind of get on the national scene a little bit more easily. And anyway, so then we were featured in a series of tweets because they did 3 endorsements that day. Another race that was in Nebraska and in Massachusetts, and the New York Times, he was the deputy editor for the Washington Bureau, or maybe the editor of the Washington Bureau, I don't remember exactly. He tweeted out something about each of those races, but for our campaign, it was the only one that mentioned the race, like ethnic type race, of the incumbent. So the tweet said something like, and we've got another one this time against an African-American female incumbent in Columbus, Ohio. And it was interesting because, that, again, this is the narrative that's getting put out there. It was following up. So that didn't just come out of nowhere. That was following up from stories that had already appeared in other publications, with Congressional Black Caucus members going on the record saying that anyone who challenges them and these Justice Democrats are just being racist. They're targeting Black representation and trying to get rid of Black congressional representatives, which, it one is not true generally, but then especially kind of a weird argument to be making when you have a Black candidate running against a Black incumbent, because I'm also Black, that, well, what exactly is the argument that you're getting at? Because no matter the outcome of this campaign, there will still be Black representation. So by not including my race in that tweet, he was feeding into that narrative. And, I think I tweeted back clarifying, and this was also stressful for me because, before running for Congress, I really had never done anything public in that way, like public facing, I should say. And so I had to, clap back in this public way and like wrote back, like, I'm also Black, jerk. And then it just took off because Roxanne Gay retweeted, and it was like, that's when it really, really took off, I would say. I don't think it was my tweet in response. I think it was that she then said, hey, whenever you're feeling like you're not good enough, shoot your shot. This guy's in charge of the New York Times Washington Bureau, and he just tried to tell this Black woman she's not Black. Because when I tweeted, he responded saying something like, I know, and then he didn't say I know, but he like pasted the picture that Justice Democrats included with their tweet and was like, I understand what's going on here, or something like that. But then it still didn't really clarify what he was getting at, because if he did understand that, then why did he leave that out of his original tweet? So anyway, all to say, it took off, and then he ended up getting demoted because this was his second infraction. I think maybe the week before he had suggested that there weren't any progressives in the South or something. I don't know. It's just something crazy. And I'm like, makes you think like, wow, this is a really prestigious publication, the New York Times. And how is this person so clueless about diversity, about America? You know, he isn't just writing, he's actually editing. So having the final say on what goes to print. So it was a pretty wild time in the campaign, but then also eye-opening that, again, we have to be fearless in checking these narratives, because even people at the top, echelons of the journalism profession can make these types of mistakes, and we've got to cut through that, because even if it seems innocuous, and I think, some people react to it like that, like, all right, whatever, the guy, just like made, it was a slip of the tongue or slip of the tweet. But no, like, if you're in that position, you have a lot of power and you need to be held accountable for your language.
And you should also understand how important language is. I mean, I would think that like somebody that's not only, like you said, a reporter at the New York Times, but also an editor would really understand how harmful those narratives are. Part of my question after the whole thing is like, why was he just demoted? Like, he seems like he was fairly incompetently doing his job. I mean, he was covering politics for way longer before that. So that's part of my questions. I'm like, I feel like not nearly enough, y'all. Like, especially with it being a second infraction. Anyway, thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate you telling us a little bit about that. I was reading over it earlier today, and it was just another one of those examples that I was like, I cannot believe that these harmful narratives are being perpetuated and continue to be perpetuated unchecked until individuals like you have to speak up and say something on a level that's even as high as the New York Times. So I appreciate you sharing. Cass, did you want to say something?
I don't want to go too much into it because we will, sorry, y'all, we will go into it more in a future episode. I'm trying to think. I think it's the 23rd of this month. We're going to be talking about diversity in the news industry. If not, it's the week after that on Matter Monday. And I think that what we're talking about is relevant to that. I don't know what this editor looks like or what his team looks like, but it's like even these really quality or more prestigious publications, more reputable publications, at the end of the day, as far as I'm aware, they're still very white and very male. And so when they're editing and covering issues of, Black politicians or whatever it might be with these campaigns, that bias and that lack of, awareness is there. But I think in this instance, based on the way you said he reacted to, it just sounds like not the way you should handle something when it's brought to your attention when you're at, that level, especially when it's being brought to your attention by somebody that you wrote about, that you got something wrong in a campaign that wasn't something to scoff at. Like, it was, something serious.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised that he wrote back, but I don't know. People have different relationships with Twitter and don't always have great judgment. So, but I think it also gets to, a fact of Washington, but then also Columbus, that there's a lot of these relationships. And so it sometimes becomes more important to preserve your relationships with existing power structures than it does to accurately portray events that are happening in reality, So that can be as relevant in Columbus, Ohio, as it is in Washington, D.C. And again, an argument for having just a greater diversity of news sources so that people can just get a full information. And I agree with you, Jay. I mean, it kind of like is unfortunate. It puts a burden on the citizen to maybe have to research a lot of different news sources, but I would almost, lean towards that rather than just one singular source that is probably unlikely to ever get it totally right.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think that like anything, right? Like, you shouldn't get all your opinions from one source. You shouldn't get all of your information from one source. I think that diversity of input on those things is really important. I think it just makes it harder for people to be informed, engaged citizens a lot of times, because if you are, if you are very strapped for time and might not be even that civically engaged anyway, or might not care about those issues inherently as much, I think it becomes so hard and creates such a barrier to entry when you have to be fact checking the sources that are supposed to already be fact checked and are supposed to already be verifiable, you know. I think it's really interesting what you mentioned about the kind of relationships with power dynamics and how those play out in the news. And I think that the news industry is one of the areas that I think that can happen fairly innocuously and people can miss it very often. For example, last year, we had a board chair at the time who is no longer our board chair, but was very involved with Gray Matter Media for a long time and Matter News as well. Kevin Truett, and he actually wrote a bit of a piece for us about the election last year. And in that, he was really saying, like, I'm really frustrated with the local news because they are not covering this election almost at all. Like, if you watch the news, and I think part of it's because it was not a big election year, right? Like there weren't like a ton of seats open. There weren't a ton of elections going on. There was important things happening, but there wasn't as much as you would normally see. And one of the points that he brought up in there, which I could go on a whole rant, as I know Cassie could as well, about kind of how city council is already set up and the problems therein with how folks end up becoming on the council. But he mentioned that for, I believe it was the council races, that they didn't even mention the challengers. They only mentioned the incumbents. Like that's the only people's names that they mentioned in the news at all. And it's like, that name recognition is such a big, important part of running a campaign. Like even just having your name mentioned on the air is important and gives you a little bit more of a buy-in. But I think that a lot of those organizations are fairly tied into the establishment in various ways and kind of poking at the powers that be, I think isn't necessarily always in their best interest. So I think that's really interesting. I think, like you said, you can see it here in Columbus just as well as you can see it being a Washington issue. Wonderful. Well, if you guys are okay with broadening our horizons a little bit, I think I'd like to talk about some kind of broader issues around kind of civic engagement and like the ideals of democratic change without it being specifically about voting. So one of the things that I noticed is a big through line in a lot of the work that you've done, Morgan, and especially with your campaign, is your strong emphasis on having a lot of grassroots support. And that's something that we've always striven for, or that we've always really worked toward and then really have, I think in some ways, been able to achieve with our donor model and with just the way that we carry our operations for Matter. And I know for Cassie specifically, being from Columbus, focusing mostly on our engagement efforts, that has been a very big focus for her in the work that we're doing and making sure that we do have that grassroots support. So for both of you, I wanted to hear a little bit about why you think that grassroots support is so important compared to other types of support you could give, both for a political campaign and for the news, whichever you feel more comfortable talking about for both of you.
You want to start, Cassie? Okay. Well, and you're talking about like grassroots funding, right? Or is that?
Yeah. I think you broaden it to be support if you'd like, because for us, like readers kind of falls into that as well. I think the focus on funding is the most important, probably.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what it comes down to is freedom, because if you're depending on just a couple large donors to, I mean, one, if you're in the context of a federal race, you'd be breaking the law if you were doing that probably, but but you know, if you're only, you know, rich donors or only corporate PACs, right? Then you're at their behest. And I have a vision of politics being rooted in true representation of the people. And to me, that means as many people as possible in whatever jurisdiction you're trying to represent. And so, you know, when you're a grassroots campaign and you're getting contributions from as many people as possible, from $1 to, you know, $5 or whatever, you're not really having to prioritize one individual, and certainly, you know, no corporation, because that's just like off the table for me altogether, for a corporate PAC, more than another. And that was a question I would get a lot during the campaigns, like, well, you know, what makes you different? Like, what does it mean to be a grassroots candidate? Isn't, you know, money's money, and money from a corporation is the same as money from a person? And it's like, well, let's be clear about that. That's not true. One, there's like a difference of scale. Corporations can, unfortunately, because our campaign finance law is screwed, you know, can give like $5,000 just in one pot. And people are limited to giving, you know, $2,800, for example. So just like how much money can be given is different. And then the other key difference between having individual grassroots donations and support versus large corporate donors is one of market power, right? Like none of my individual donors has the ability to set the terms of employment for 60,000 employees. Who can do that? JP Morgan Chase, right? And I'm not saying that JP Morgan Chase is bad because they can do that. That is the reality of the economic system that we have created. But it does mean that $5,000 from that type of company is very different from $50 or even $500 from an individual. And so, to me, we have to have this model of politics really at every level of government to be able to have representatives that we can trust, can stay on the side of people, and so that we have true representation of our interests at the table of legislation, regulation, all of it. It's absolutely crucial, and without it, we'll continue to see the erosion of trust in our democracy that is at a pretty low point as it is. It's really the only option for getting our government to work for us.
And sorry that I'm not cutting in quickly to when you ask me quick things, because he has to adjust my levels each time I talk. So sorry, y'all. I would start out by just echoing what Morgan said at the beginning was super relevant to us as independent news outlet, which is that, if we're owned by powerful people or, large donors or, advertisers, then we can't hold those people accountable. And I know that we talked to a investigative outlet in another state. I think about a year ago, we were just kind of getting some advice from them on like financing. And they said that they had a large donor who I think gave them like $10,000 a year or something. And they wrote something investigative about that person and they pulled their donation. And that really hurt, especially for a small operation. So that's super important to consider that. But really for me, in terms of building Matter News or really anything that's purpose driven, is really making sure that your means match the ends. So if we want to be a newsroom for the people that's, for the community, as a community newsroom, it can't be financed primarily or exclusively by big companies and big donors. It has to be supported and primarily financed by the people, in my opinion. And that's kind of the whole like means matching the ends thing. We have to ensure that if we want a news outlet for the people, it's by the people. And so I think that Matter, we've done a good job, like you said, of kind of making that our focus. And it is tough. And I'm sure anyone who's run for office, it's so tough to raise a good amount of money to sustain yourself on small donors. But at the end of the day, whenever you're trying to do something significant and big, like running for office or building a news outlet, that community is what's going to keep you from burning out and from giving up, and just make it possible to do what you're trying to do. So it may take some years, and I know it's taken us 2 years to start feeling like we've built up a good amount of momentum where we're starting to really feel that community support at a level that's really sustaining us, I think. But it takes time, and it's really, labor intensive and time intensive to build up that base, but also to maintain it and grow it.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's very similar to political context because it's all about your end. So my end isn't like crowning myself in Washington or whatever, right? Like my end is always about empowering people to believe that it's worth engaging in the political process. And if people have invested in you, even if the outcome of the election or a specific election doesn't go the way that you want, that empowerment doesn't go away. And that's what you continue to build from, right? If you're just, like a corporate funded shill, and just like you're saying, the people that, tend to get a lot more news coverage very easily, that doesn't motivate people to care, right? And there's a reason why we have seen, we had good turnout in this election, but it doesn't make people want to participate in every single election because it's like, oh, it's the same characters, they always win, whatever. It's like, it doesn't matter. But when people have really like put themselves out there to help mold what you're building, what you're talking about, that they feel like they have the ability to actually like get in touch with you and you will respond. That is how we like rebuild our whole community, and just like change the governance structure. And that's really important. So beyond just like the dollars themselves, it's about what are we actually trying to build. And to me, I want a Columbus where everybody feels like the political process is worth participating in, and actually we have the power. Power is not distant, power is right here.
Oh, wow, that sounds amazing. Very happy to work toward that goal, absolutely. Well, I have a bunch more questions, but not a lot more time. So I'm probably going to stop with questions, but I do want to give you guys both a chance to give any final thoughts that you have, and then I'll kind of wrap up our session here. Morgan, if you want to go first.
Yeah, not too much more to add. I really appreciate y'all having me. I'm a big fan of Matter News, so I hope everybody does support. And like I said, I mean, this is about creating, to me, a diverse landscape of different media sources. And it isn't to say, one media source is bad and only Matter News is good, but there are realities of what you all are going to be able to do that, maybe like a corporate funded news source is not going to be able to do as much, like Cassie was talking about. Having people, on the ground that are just going to stream footage for 2 hours. Well, that's not going to make sense for every news outlet's business model. And, I really do think that we grow as a community with having, a diverse set of trusted brokers of information, and that it's clear, it's not just a profit motive. It's actually just about giving as much information as possible to people, and they do with it what they will. So really grateful to be here, and want to encourage everybody, support Matter News. You're matching. This is a fundraiser, right? Did y'all make your ask? I hope Cassie will. Okay.
You all can hear me. Yes. Sorry about that, technical difficulties again. So we are in the middle of a News Match fundraiser. News Match is a national organization that every November through December matches nonprofit newsrooms donations. They double any one-time donations and actually multiply any monthly donations by 12. So the whole year's worth of someone's monthly donation they'll match. We just launched that on the 1st, and it'll be going through the end of the year. And really to wrap up with this subject, I don't have too much more to say. I really appreciate, Morgan, you being on here. This is the first time we've had a guest on one of these shows, and it's really fun to get to kick around some of these ideas with someone else. And I think, like you said, I really just want to echo that we as Gray Matter Media and Matter News are so huge on evolving the local news industry as a whole. And like you said, that means more than just Matter News. And that's why we've been so grateful for the news outlets locally, Columbus Navigator, WCBE, some of these other outlets that could be competitors, but instead are seeing us as a collaborator and have really supported what we're doing from the beginning. And they are very different in the way that they operate, what they do, who owns them, how they're funded. And we don't care, because at the end of the day, we want more independent, more local, more different kinds of funding models, because at the end of the day, we very much believe in nonprofit news and do believe it's the most ethical model, especially when it comes to holding democracy up and sort of being that watchdog for the people. But at the end of the day, like you said, we need Matter News, and we try to really employ a diverse set of contributors and have a diverse board and things like that. But we're one organization that's going to have one culture and things like that. So we need others that have their own cultures, their own ways of editing, their own unique models. And that's really what we hope to inspire, to create a bunch of different watchdogs. And I think one of the ways that we're trying to do that too, and when you're really talking about playing the watchdog role for democracy, I think we also have to start thinking more collectively if we're trying to fill that collective role of having a watchdog for the people. And so one of the things that us co-founders of Matter have been helping get off the ground is the Ohio Watchdog Media Collective. It is piloting hopefully this month, and we are just a bunch of people locally, not all media. Actually, a lot of the people involved are just people with cameras or people that just want to help out with information organizing. to cover protests. And so I think that I'm really also really interested in cooperative models and just things even beyond what we're used to seeing with just nonprofit versus corporate media. I'm really interested in like the Double Strips co-op model, and there's also just so many different kind of collective models that I think could be in place to fill some of these gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Cassie. And along the lines of what you're saying, and I've said this a few times before, it's an ecosystem, right? Like it's an information ecosystem that we all play a role in. Matter News is not breaking news. Like, we don't do breaking news. We need the dispatches. We need the news networks. Like, we need them to do the breaking news so we can hear about those stories, and then we can take it and look even deeper and go even farther, do the records requests, do the data compiling, do that kind of longer, more in-depth investigative work that a lot of times they can't afford to do because of their own profit models. So I absolutely agree. I think the diversity media is our best hope for supporting democracy and making sure that that watchdog is going strong. So with that, thank you both so much. Morgan, a special thank you to you. We really appreciate you coming on and being flexible with us and bearing with any technical difficulties as well. As Cassie mentioned, this is part of a fundraiser that is going on for this month and next. Any donation we receive will be matched, so we'll get it at least doubled, but it'll go even farther if you become a member. So you can become a member by going to matternews.org/join, and you can sign up for a membership at various different levels. Depending on how much you decide to give monthly, you get different perks. So anyone who's giving to us monthly gets a newsletter, and then some folks get a sticker or t-shirt or early access to events, things like that. So go to matternews.org/join. You can see what those membership levels are. And if you become a member, we'll get 12 times your donation. So make your donations go even further by doing that. Thank you both so much again for joining us and for the conversation.
Last thing, I just want to thank our sponsors, Night Road Studio, who's live streaming all of these events for us and bearing with us as we have to switch up our setup and try new things. And then also to Wild Goose Creative. We're not there physically tonight as we were last week and will be the next weeks, but they are hosting us in their space for these weekly Matter Monday events. So we appreciate you, Wild Goose Creative and Night Road Studio, for making these events possible.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. All right. Thank you all and have a wonderful night.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.